Welcome everybody to Planning Meeting 2020, which is 20 to 34 Newcombe Street and 25 to 27 Fenwick Street. And as we always do, we acknowledge the Wadawurrung people as the traditional owners of the land, waterways and skies. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and we acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of the Greater Geelong community today. Well, welcome again, and once again, I'm so sorry we've all had to wait. It was circumstances beyond all of us. And I would like to introduce, I'm Councillor Jim Mason, chairing the meeting tonight, and going from my left, I'd like to introduce Councillor Anthony Aitken, Councillor Bruce Harwood, and on the screen behind us, Councillor Asher, Mayor Sullivan and Councillor Cadwell. I'd also like to introduce the officers. If you could indicate, please, Lewis Buston, Principal Planner, who will be taking the lead in the officer case tonight, assisted by Sylvie Tynan, Town Planner, John Rush, who's behind us somewhere, making sure the live streaming's working, who is a coordinator of statutory planning, and Joanne van Sluggeren, who is the overall manager of city development. We have apologies tonight from Councillors Maloney, Murray, Grisbeck, Nelson and Contell. Do we have any declarations of conflict of interest? No? I'll move on then to the confirmation of the minutes of the planning meeting held on the 30th of March 2023. Could we, Councillor Sullivan, and seconded? Councillor Aitken. Those in favour? Carried. Thank you very much. So the procedure for the meeting tonight for the hearing of the items will be: first, the officer will present a brief summary of the written report to the committee. The panel may ask questions of the officer. The objectors or submitters will detail their concerns to the committee, and we will have a 3-minute time limit. Please try and respect that. The panel may ask questions then of the objector and the submitter. The applicant will then detail their application and respond to any objector submitter concerns to the committee, and there can be a 5 to 10 minute time limit for the applicant. The panel may ask questions of the applicant. The panel will further discuss the application and make a decision. This decision of this committee is the final decision of the council, acting under a delegated authority. And if anybody is aggrieved of this decision, then they can take it further and appeal to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal in Melbourne, and our staff will assist you in this process during office hours. So we will proceed now with Lewis. Would you please make your case?
Thank you, Chair. So I described the site and the surrounding area in a fair bit of detail in the application, in the assessment report rather, but I'll just go through the zones and the overlays that apply at the moment. So the subject site is situated within 2 zones. It's partly covered by a design and development overlay Schedule 21, and the northern side of the site, being numbers 20 and 22 to 34 Newcombe Street, are zoned Commercial 1 zone, adjacent to a Transport Zone 2, being Newcombe Street, and are within that design and development overlay Schedule 21, which applies to the Portarlington Town Centre. Southern side of the site, being numbers 25 and 27 Fenwick Street, and an accessway portion of 22 to 34 Newcombe Street, is zoned Residential Growth Zone Schedule 3, and this part of the site is not subject to any overlays, so it's not within the design and development overlay Schedule 21. The application seeks a planning permit for the use and development of the site for a mixed-use proposal. It comprises 59 dwellings in the form of apartments, 7 commercial tenancies fronting Newcombe Street at ground level, and associated subdivision, and a reduction in the on-site car parking requirements. For the purpose of assessing the application against the planning controls that apply to the different parts of the site, it's probably easiest to consider the proposal as 2 elements. So you've got the Newcombe Street side, which is zoned Commercial 1 zone and within the DDO 21, as I mentioned, and the Fenwick Street side, which is zoned Residential Growth Zone Schedule 3. A central courtyard with a minimum width of about 10 metres segregates these 2 built form elements above ground, and this is shown in figures 28 and 29 on pages 59 and 60 of the agenda. The Newcombe Street side exhibits a maximum 5-storey building with a height of 16 metres. It comprises 7 retail units at street level. There's a common residential area behind those retail units and 35 apartments on the upper levels. The building is attached at ground level, fronting Newcombe Street, and as it addresses Newcombe Street at first floor level and above, that building is separated into effectively 3 wings, which are sited 9.2 metres apart at their northern elevation. Notably though, the western wing is only 4 storeys with a maximum height of about 13 metres. The top 2 floor levels fronting Newcombe Street would be recessed from that street boundary, so the 4th level is set back 6.7 metres from the street, and the 5th floor level on those eastern and central wings would be set back 19.5 metres from the street. Turning to the Fenwick Street side, this building is a proposed 4-storey building, which is split into 2 wings. At its street frontage to Fenwick Street, it would appear as a 3-storey building, given the slope of the land, so the 4 storeys face in towards the central courtyard. The maximum height of this building would be 11.5 metres above ground level. The ground and 2nd storey would be set back 4.5 metres to the street with projecting roofs and balconies which encroach this by 2 metres. And the 3rd storey fronting Fenwick Street would be set back about 10.5 metres from the street. There's a fair bit of landscaping proposed as well, so it incorporates 4 main landscaped areas between those 2 wings, or those being rather between the 2 wings facing Fenwick Street, the central courtyard between the Newcombe Street and the Fenwick Street sides of the development, and 2 landscaped areas at the effective 1st floor level fronting Newcombe Street, which would segregate the building forms presenting to Newcombe Street at those upper floor levels. Vehicle access is proposed to be entirely from Fenwick Street. All car parking is proposed to be at basement level. The total number of car parks proposed is 85, and those parking spaces would service the dwellings and the commercial premises. That figure of 85 is a reduction of the statutory rate of car parking required by 29, so the application seeks approval for that reduction of 29 parking spaces. Those 29 spaces would be made up of 11 visitor spaces for the proposed dwellings and 18 parking spaces for the proposed commercial tenancies. In terms of the residential component of the proposal, every dwelling is provided with the required car parking for residents. So that is 2 spaces to each 3 or more bedroom apartment and 1 space to each 1 and 2 bedroom apartment. The application's been referred to relevant external referrals, including Transport for Victoria and servicing authorities, and none of those referral authorities have raised any objections to the grant of a permit subject to conditions. And internally, the application's been referred to multiple departments, and those responses have been detailed in the report. All internal departments are supportive except for urban design and strategic planning, which both raised design response concerns, largely relating back to the DDO 21 design responses and objectives. During the assessment of the application, council officers and the applicant sought a design review from the Victorian Design Review Panel, which is run by the Office of the Victorian Government Architect. And this is an entirely voluntary process, and the applicant actively participated in this at the request of council officers. The design review identified that a stronger response to the context regarding height, massing, site impact and materiality was appropriate, whilst also outlining that some further consideration of sight lines from the foreshore was needing to be explored. After this, the application was amended following that review. Those amendments included to reduce the building height fronting Newcombe Street and to incorporate building materials which are more prevalent along the northern side of Newcombe Street. And in addition to that, views towards the site from the foreshore were further explored, and it was identified that the proposal would not be unreasonably incongruous when viewed from the foreshore. So, as a result of the public notification process, the application received 29 objections and 44 submissions supporting the proposal. Consultation was not held, but the amended plans that were received were circulated to all objectors, and an opportunity to provide further comment or further concerns was also provided as well. The objections are summarised in the report as well, but generally they relate to the proposal resulting in an inappropriate building form and design response, an insufficient response to planning policy, loss of views from dwellings in the residential growth zone to the south, road safety and car parking demand, impacts and amenity impacts on neighbouring properties, including dwellings, and strain on existing utility infrastructure. Turning to the assessment, the application's been assessed against relevant planning scheme controls and policies which are applicable to the different parts of the site. So in the agenda, you'll notice it's been split up into those 2 elements of the Fenwick Street and the Newcombe Street sides. So effectively what that means is assessing the Newcombe Street side against the requirements of the Commercial 1 zone, the Design and Development Overlay Schedule 21, and relevant planning policy and particular provisions, including Clause 58, which applies to apartment developments of 5 or more stories, and assessing the Fenwick Street side against the requirements of the Residential Growth Zone Schedule 3, and relevant planning policy and particular provisions, including Clause 55 and Clause 55.07, which applies to apartment developments of up to 4 stories. So in response to planning policy, the scheme contains local policy applying to the Bellarine Peninsula, and it sets objectives and strategies for the townships on the Bellarine. The objectives of these policies for Portarlington, again, are detailed in the assessment report, but specific to this site and this particular application, the policy identifies the subject site as a development opportunity and seeks the development of a focal building on this site. That particular local policy also references the Portarlington Structure Plan. That was amended in 2017, and the structure plan makes specific reference to this site as well, and outlined that the site is a major development opportunity, and that since at least 2008, development of the site has been a priority. It's been recommended that the site is developed as a focal building, and that a mix of land use options could be considered, including accommodation at upper floor levels. This term, focal building, is outlined a lot in relation to this site and the urban design frameworks and structure plans and policy applicable to the Portarlington town centre. And it's not a term that's defined within the planning scheme or within the Planning and Environment Act, but VCAT has considered what constitutes a focal building in its decision to set aside the council's refusal of a 3-storey building with shops at ground floor level at 1 to 2 Bluff Road in St Leonards. In its decision, the tribunal found that a focal building can, in fact, be a building distinguished by its height, and as a result, this proposal would undeniably result in a focal building on the subject site and responds to this policy direction. Local planning policy also applies, which identifies the whole of the site within an increased housing diversity area. And so these are areas which have been identified as being appropriate for increased housing density and diversity. Objectives and strategies that apply to these areas include to evolve the character of increased housing diversity areas through more intensive development, to support development that makes a positive architectural contribution, to maximise opportunities for housing by accommodating high density housing in activity centres, and to encourage a diversity of housing to cater for a variety of lifestyle needs. So the built form proposed is considered to offer an appropriate scale of development within this location in the Portarlington town centre. The height, siting and design of the proposed apartment building is considered to be site responsive in that it limits its height to 3 storeys at the frontage to Fenwick Street within the residential growth zone. And its northern frontage to Newcombe Street incorporates open balconies at 1st and 2nd floor levels and recessed 4th and 5th floor levels. This contributes to a lightness of built form and responds to the IHDA policy to recess upper floor levels to reduce the dominance of of the building form from adjoining properties and the streetscape. Proposal would also provide a design response which incorporates appropriate side and rear setbacks in the context of the site, basement car parking which is generally obscured from view within the street apart from those access points, and a combination of external materials of lightweight finishes such as white concrete render, glass balustrades and timber look cladding. So in response to the residential growth zone, which are the 2 parcels at 25 and 27 Fenwick Street, it's considered the application suitably responds to the purpose of the residential growth zone. It provides housing at increased densities in a location in close proximity to the Portarlington town centre. It incorporates a maximum of 4 storeys, again just in that residential growth zone, with the front elevation to Fenwick Street being a maximum of 3 storeys and that 3rd storey recessed behind the bottom 2 floors. Additionally, it's considered that recessing of the 3rd storey assists in providing somewhat of a transition in scale back towards the more typical single and double storey dwellings in that residential growth zone to the south. In response to the commercial zone, the commercial 1 zone, the proposal is considered to respond to the purpose of that zone. It incorporates an active frontage to Newcombe Street at ground level with residential uses above, and this would assist in both activating the existing vacant street frontage through commercial tenancies at ground level and supporting the vitality of the centre with dwellings above as well. So just going to comment in relation to the DDO 21 because it's quite an it effectively sets the design objectives and responses for this part of the site that's in the commercial 1 zone. Those objectives set out in the DDO 21 seek to reinforce the centre's proximity to the bay and protect existing views and vistas from the town centre by protecting views of the bay from intrusion by structures and signage, ensuring appropriate building frontage rhythm that reflects traditional strip shopping by retaining narrow frontage treatments for those retail tenancies, ensuring commercial buildings address the street by developing new buildings to have a setback matching facades of adjoining shop fronts, and ensuring that new buildings are designed to respond to the characteristics of the site and the locality and demonstrate a high standard of contemporary expression. So in response to these particular objectives, it's considered that the proposal does reinforce the centre's proximity to the bay. It would not impede on views from the town centre to the foreshore. Notably, the DDO 21 does not make reference to protecting views from outside the town centre. It refers to views from the town centre to the foreshore. So the siting of the proposal at the western edge of the town centre and the southern side of Newcombe Street would ensure that this proposal wouldn't impede on those existing views from the town centre to the foreshore. Existing narrow frontage treatment would also be reflected at that ground floor level of the proposal. The shop fronts that are proposed have a width of approximately 7 metres with a 0 lot setback, so they're built right up to the street frontage, and that would reflect the majority of commercial tenancies within that southern side of Newcombe Street. The residential component at upper levels also exhibits building elements which are reflective of contemporary interpretation of this narrow rhythm as well, so it continues up through the levels above. And in doing so, it's considered the proposal does respect the character of the town centre. Notably as well, in the Portarlington urban design framework, it makes specific reference to there being no clearly established distinguishable coastal character in the Portarlington town centre. So it obviously has a character, but it's one that's varied, and this proposal is considered to respond to that. Whilst the buildings would exceed 2 stories, so the DDO has an objective in it that says to generally restrict buildings to 2 stories in height, but it doesn't say do not build over 2 stories. What it does is it says if you do go over 2 stories, you need to do certain things, or the building needs to do certain things, and they are be sympathetic to heritage buildings and nearby residential interfaces, be visually unobtrusive in views from the foreshore, and be of high quality design. So the proposal is sensitive, or sympathetic rather, to heritage buildings, given its siting away from existing buildings of heritage significance. Additionally, with the recessed upper floor levels, as the building goes up, it increases its separation from existing buildings of heritage significance in the town centre as well. I suppose importantly, the Grand Hotel is a key focal point of the town centre, and this site is about 210 metres from the Grand Hotel, so that's considered a substantial separation distance, which would aid in ensuring that the proposal doesn't become a focal point that competes with the Grand Hotel. The interface to neighbouring residential buildings is considered to be suitably managed as well. The land's owned residential growth zone, which adjoins the subject site, needs to be considered in view of its abuttal to a commercial zone in this regard. And it's considered that the proposal would provide a visual transition in building heights between the residential growth zone to the southwest and the commercial 1 zone, akin to that which would be, or that which would account for legitimate expectations at the interface of a residential growth zone and a commercial 1 zone. That also particularly in view of the step down of building height, or the effective 4-storey western wing fronting Newcombe Street as opposed to a 5-storey building in that part of the site. The proposal is considered to be a high quality design. The DDO 21 doesn't outline what is considered high quality design, but the relevant objectives outline that buildings should be designed to respond to the character of the site and demonstrate a high standard of contemporary expression. And in this respect, the proposal is site responsive as outlined in relation to its interfaces with residential areas and heritage buildings in the foreshore. The proposal incorporates a contemporary interpretation of that existing varied character identified in the town centre. Particularly, it provides separation between proposed wings at upper floor levels with lightweight elevation treatments and visual articulation between floor levels and adequate side setbacks while providing an active frontage along the entirety of the ground level fronting Newcombe Street. So there's a bit to it, but to summarise, the application's being considered against relevant policy, the commercial 1 zone and the residential growth zone, the design and development overlay schedule 21 and relevant particular provisions. It would provide an increase in housing diversity rather in an area which has been identified as being appropriate for an increase in housing diversity and density in proximity to a local town centre as well. The proposal would provide a focal building on this site. And again, the site's been identified as a major development opportunity in numerous strategic planning documents and policy applicable to the site. And it's considered that the proposal would achieve this while respecting the identified varied character of the town centre, particularly given it wouldn't be visually incongruous when viewed from the foreshore. Varying heights and siting of buildings as proposed is considered to suitably interact with neighbouring sites, including those adjacent dwellings in the residential growth zone, and additionally the application's been assessed against the objectives and standards of clause 55 and clause 58, and it's considered to represent an appropriate design response to these objectives for apartment developments, and it is recommended that the committee determine to issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit subject to the conditions contained in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Very comprehensive overview. I've got one question for you, please. I note that you mentioned the design review panel. At one stage there were 62 apartments or dwellings, and it was reduced, I think, to 59. At what stage did that happen?
In relation to the design review, it was after the design review.
So was that an extra story or was it just recessed?
What that did was it removed, it didn't remove a whole story from the eastern and central wings fronting Newcombe Street. It removed effectively the front half of it, so that setback of 19.5 metres, that was increased, that was as a result of removing those dwellings, and it removed an entire story off the western wing, which on that left-hand side, if you look at the plans.
Thank you. Now, councillors, do we have any other questions at this stage? No? Thank you for the moment, Lewis. So now we will consider some questions. First, from an objector, John Keeney. Is John here? Yeah, well, who have you decided that with? Well, who wants to go first? Can you please name what's your name, please?
Jeff Callan.
Okay, Jeff, you come forward, please.
Thank you.
Yes, take a seat and just formally tell us who you are, and you've got 3 minutes after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Callan. My wife Chris and I live at 5 High Street, adjoining the proposed development, and to the west of the 4-storey buildings at 25 and 27 Fenwick Street. Fenwick Street properties are zoned residential, and viewed looking east, as we do from our bedrooms and deck, will appear clearly as buildings of 4, not 3 storeys, a scale not previously allowed on residential land in this area. There is no disguising the fact that the proposed buildings across the total site are 4 and 5 storeys in a residential area, regardless of their zoning. We believe that this proposal represents a litmus test for what can happen with future developments within the designated growth zone of Portarlington. If this application is allowed, it will provide a template for future 4 and 5-storey developments in residential zones. It has the capacity to be a precedent which alters the fabric of the town. We endorse the opinions expressed by the Victorian Architect Review Panel when in 2020 they stated that the proposed building height and bulk is excessive. And further they said, there is a disconnect between the scale, bulk and footprint of the proposal compared to the surrounding context. We, the neighbouring residents, are the surrounding context. In regard to parking, the developer asserts that overflow car parking can be suitably accommodated on the surrounding street network, a poor excuse for failing to provide sufficient on-site parking. Our lived experience informs us that overflow parking will lead to a private nuisance noise, incidents involving nighttime door slamming, loud and sometimes raucous voices. The developer argues that the height of the building fronting Newcombe Street will not be visible from the pier, but viewed from the main beach at several points, and certainly from the Spirit of Tasmania, it will be the dominant building in the town. The planning policy framework of the Greater Geelong Planning Scheme states that design development on the periphery of the residential growth zones is to be responsive and respectful of the neighbourhood character in any adjoining residential zones. Councillors, the planning proposals before you are not respectful of the neighbourhood character of our location in Portarlington, nor of residents whose properties adjoin the proposed development. We urge you to reject this application and invite the developers to submit an alternative, socially responsible proposal for these locations. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. Councillors, any questions? Thanks very much, Jeff. Is it Jonathan coming next? Jonathan Fernandez.
Yes, good evening. I'm Jonathan Fernandez, and with my wife Glenda, we've owned the property at 3 High Street for 30 plus years. Now, we believe it's obviously a gross overdevelopment. We're going to be enclosed on 2 sides by this development, which is to us 5 stories. The morning light will be blocked out, our privacy will be invaded, we'll be subjected to noise that's been unprecedented in that area. So our main problems, other than everything that Jeff has outlined, is that we will personally be significantly affected by this development and will really impair our enjoyment of Portarlington, which through these years has been a wonderful place for us to come to get away from what is essentially going to be built right on the other side of our back fence. So anything that would reduce this excessive height of the development would be of benefit to us, and we feel we're going to be most profoundly affected by this. So I hope you take these things into consideration when you make your decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a moment.
Sure.
Any questions, councillors? Thank you. So is it Christine now or John?
My name's John Keeney and I'm here with my wife Joan. We're at 29 Fenwick Street and we've been there for about 30 years. There are three issues I wanted to discuss with you tonight. Non-compliance with the planning scheme and planning policy, leading to the second issue, an overdevelopment of the site, and the third issue are traffic and parking aspects of the application. Now, our reference point for our assessment is what you have in front of you, which is a really comprehensive, thorough officer report that Lewis has prepared. And it's in particular the summary that's been provided at pages 5 to 7 of the agenda you have. I just wanted to talk about context in the as I get to policy. At page 25 of the report, reference is made to the Grand Hotel and to the adjoining residential building that you'd all know in Newcombe Street, which is described in the report as a 3-storey building. So that gives you some sense of what's there now and gives you a reference point for the sort of building that's proposed next door. Now, what's proposed next door is detailed as Lewis has taken you through at page 5 of your report, which talks of a 4-storey building to Fenwick, 5 stories to Newcombe, acknowledging there are some recessing as we go. Now, what I don't think is apparent to you enough from the material you've got are the policy controls that apply to this site. DDO 21 affects the front part of the land, and it, at page 72 of your report, it says these words: generally restrict buildings to a maximum of 2 stories. It does go on to acknowledge variations, certainly, but you compare with what's proposed at 5 stories with what the DDO is talking about as 2 stories, and also reference it to your context, which is that 3-storey building down the road. Now, the second aspect that's mentioned at page 5 of the report is what's known as clause 16.011L. That relates to the increased housing diversity areas right across the municipality, be they Geelong West, South Geelong, Bowen Heads, Ocean Grove or Portarlington. And it contains these words: encourage development of up to 3 stories. 3-storey should be located on larger sites. We don't quarrel with that. It goes on to say encourage the recessing of the 3rd storey. So you've got a very clear policy picture emerges of a 2 to 3 storey built form in this part of Portarlington. Now you compare that with what's proposed at 4 and 5 stories, and it leads to our second point, that this is a significant and gross overdevelopment of this site. None of us quarrel with a building that is built to the standards suggested in your planning scheme at 2 to 3 stories. But it's a quantum leap to in effect double that to what is being proposed. And as you've heard, we're not alone here. Council's Strategic Planning Department is not supportive of this application. And the
You'll have to finish up.
And I'll finish up. And the Victorian Government Architect is not supportive. There have been tweaks to that, but no more than tweaks. So the last point is simply that there is insufficient parking provided by 29 spaces, and this is an undeveloped site. There's no excuse for not providing the required amount of spaces on an undeveloped site. And the very last point, if I may, just quickly, is a safety issue about access onto Fenwick Street. It's a wide street, as you know, with very narrow sight lines to the east and west in the vicinity of this site. Cars speed along there. 3 years ago, a electric light pole was taken out on Fenwick Street by a speeding car.
John, you should have done a tag team on this one.
That's all I wanted to
time's up.
say, Mr Chairman, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
So, do we have any questions, councillors? I maybe have a question, please, for Lewis. When, John, you've raised the question about the safety aspect about emerging cars. Do you have a response to that, Lewis?
I suppose my response would effectively be that the application has been supported by a transport or a traffic impact assessment prepared by a traffic engineer in regard to the relevant standards or design standards that are contained within Clause 5206 of the planning scheme. That's also been reviewed by the council's own traffic engineers, and no concerns were raised in relation to a traffic safety issue.
Thank you. Any other questions, councillors? Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Now, is Christine here? Christine Callan. You right to come out? Oh, well, there you did do a tag team. I'm so sorry. Well, it's okay. It's okay. If you wanted to finish just a little bit more on cars, if you're happy now, have you said it all?
Can I?
Yep. Come out to the front.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm Chris Callan. I live at 5 High Street, and I have found that going towards up High Street, across Fenwick Street is extremely dangerous, and coming down the other way exactly the same. So if you're going up High Street and you want to cross that road or turn into Fenwick Street, you cannot see a car down the bottom of that hill. If you stop and look down, you cannot see it until it's at least halfway up the hill, and it's an extremely dangerous intersection to have something like 30 or 40 or 50 cars going into a big development with that sort of dangerous situation in that corner particularly.
All right, Christine. Any questions? Thanks very much. So we now have our fifth not objector, this time a supporter, Tom O'Connor.
Thank you, councillors. I want to add my support to the recommendation of council and acknowledge the work involved in this complex, visionary and responsible report, and in particular the work of Lewis Muston. Well done. The focus for the future, particularly for coastal growth, noting the inclusion of the green travel plan, is something that is very significant as we look ahead, as we look to the future. I go back to this document. This document is so important. It addresses the look and feel for our future. It's fundamental, particularly to Portarlington. It's consistent with the 20-year tourism development plan, along with, as Lewis mentioned, along with the 2011 UDF and the 2016 structure plan, or did you say 2017, Lou? Structure plan 2016 or 2017?
Tom, just talk directly, please. It's not an interaction with Lewis.
Thank you. And the 2016 structure plan plus council's sustainability principles. Thank you, Councillor Asher. In summary, an excellent landmark model for future urban coastal growth projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Have you finished?
Sorry? You finished, yes.
Any questions for Tom? Thanks, Tom. Ashley Andrew.
Evening, I'm Ashley Andrew. I'm the President of the Portarlington Business Development Association, and I'm here to speak in support of the proposal. The entrance to Portarlington with the building of this development will be of major significance. It will bookend the town with a spectacular contemporary building as people entering Portarlington, with the hotel at the other end of Portarlington. The economic benefits to Portarlington during the construction and the post-construction will inject significant funding into Portarlington. There's been a massive investment in Portarlington in the last 10 years by state, federal governments and private enterprise. The likes of the ferry, the upgrades of the fire station, the school, we now have a supermarket, we have a petrol station, and 10 years ago, Portarlington was a sleepy fishing village that was going absolutely nowhere. Like a lot of country regional towns, it was just going to wither and die. Accommodation is one of the 4 points that we really need in Portarlington, and this particular proposed development will add significant short-term accommodation to Portarlington. There is a journal recognised worldwide called the Lonely Planet book, and it said in 2017 that the Bellarine Peninsula was in the top 10 destinations in their view in the world, not Australia, in the world. Since that time, the addition of accommodation in Portarlington has actually gone backwards. So there has been no more accommodation created in Portarlington since that report. We have a couple of major festivals each year, the Mussel Festival and the Celtic Festival, among other tourism events that we have, and people can't stay overnight because the people that attended the previous years obviously rebooked that accommodation, and we have no more accommodation for those people to come and enjoy Portarlington for its future. The actual 7 retail shops that will be developed there as well, with the ferry bringing over tourists from Melbourne, we need to have attractions and we need things for people to do. And if we don't endorse developments like this, then we will not have people come over to look at these attractions there. One thing I must say, because I've come from a different tact with all of this, is that I haven't heard anyone say that they're upset with their house prices trebling in the last 5 years in Portarlington, and I'm sure the council benefits significantly from that with rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Again, any questions, councillors?
Yeah, I do actually. Thanks for coming in, Ashley. You stated at the start of your time allotment that the team would significantly experience an economic boost during construction. How do you see that happening?
Well, the people that will actually be building it, I'm told, are regional builders, so they're from the Geelong area or around our area. So obviously a development of that size is going to take a considerable time to build. So obviously you'll have builders, tradesmen, etc. there, and obviously they will be supporting our retail sector in the main street whilst that construction's going on. After the construction, of course, you're going to have 59 apartments and 7 retail outlets, which is significantly going to contribute to the economic growth of Portarlington upon completion.
Because I'm curious how you say that, because I'm curious if there are any commitments to local procurement and whatnot for the workforce during development.
Sorry,
I'm curious if there are commitments to local procurement for the workforce during development.
my understanding is that the people that are going to construct the building are all from this region, i.e. the Geelong region, that are going to be involved in the construction of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Sullivan. Thank you, Ashley. So now, Mr. John Ray, another supporter.
Thank you. And mine, similar lines to Ashley there. So 11 years ago we decided we wanted ferries, and it took us that long to get them. But it is just thriving at the moment. We've got 3 ferries running, and what we don't have is accommodation. There is no doubt in my mind about that. I work closely with the ferry people, but I also work closely with the people that are working on this project. And this is vital for Portarlington. We need to be going forward and looking for holding people within our group. They spend money. Currently, there's one that is not able to be done because the wedding, I asked the person of the wedding, can we stay the night, the family, because we haven't seen each other since the last funeral, was the actual words they used. And they said, how many people? And they said, we want to 200. And they said, no, there's no one here that we can do that in Portarlington. And we are the gem of our area. There's no doubt about that. We have bypassed all of those other that have challenged us previously now. We've got a hotel that is magnificent, but we need more, with less accommodation than when they weren't so magnificent. So we've got that, but this we need. We need these numbers, and I have seen the plans, and I think it's a brilliant exhibition of what we do need. It is made of the quality that Portarlington is showing now all along the way. We really are a very, very important #1 city on the Bellarine at present. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, John. Questions? Thank you.
Yep.
So that finishes the supporter submissions, and now the applicant. I think Tony Sinnock and Dominic Sincock, and Dominic Monet. Are you going to present together? Yep. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to make a submission tonight. This is an application that's been with Council for almost 3 years. We've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort working with council officers, working through design issues and so on, to get to a point where we have something which we say is a positive contribution to Portarlington. It's a mixed-use development on a key site that addresses a raft of planning policy and controls that apply to it. Dominic purchased the property about 18 years ago. He was invited to meet with council officers at that time to talk about its future development. Staff encouraged him to make an application at that time. We're here now because the introduction of the ferry as a key sort of connection between Portarlington and Melbourne has arrived. What we've got here is an application that has substantial community support. I've never sat in a meeting like this and had supporters speak to an application. We've got the Portarlington Business Association, the Portarlington Community Association supporting the application, which we think is incredible. reason we see this project before council, and I may be wrong, is that it's one that is introducing a fairly substantial sort of extent of change. It's the biggest development proposed for Portarlington on a key site in the commercial centre. So we think the key issue for council tonight is whether the development's appropriate having regard to the strategic context and the strategic direction provided in the planning scheme, and given the immediate context of the site. So Lewis has already outlined the sites within 2 zones, and in this regard it's sometimes of value to actually consider how each of those sites and each of those zones would be dealt with. So we've got the residential growth zone on the south side on Fenwick Street and the commercial on the north side. And the site falls 6 metres from Fenwick Street to Newcombe Street. So on the residential growth land, we can build up to 11.5 metres. And the res growth zone purpose, there's numerous, but if I can just point you to 2, to provide housing at increased densities in buildings up to and including 4-storey, to encourage a diversity of housing types in locations offering good access to services and transport, including activity centres and town centres. So we're ticking those boxes. Geelong then have another policy that's specific to their increased housing diversity areas, and that strategy is to increase housing diversity in growth areas through the delivery of a broad range of lot sizes capable of accommodating a variety of housing types, including mixed use and high and medium density housing in strategically identified locations. And the general strategies within that include to maximise opportunities for housing in the IHDA by accommodating high density housing in the activity centres consistent with their primary commercial and retail role, and medium density housing in residential areas with more intensive development located closest to the core of activity centres. So essentially what we've delivered here is a 4-storey building that accommodates alternate housing forms. It's in a built form and reflects a higher density given its immediate abuttal to that commercial zone. The form of housing is encouraged by policy in the zone, with lower density housing expected on the periphery of the IHDA. So importantly, if this form of housing is not supported in this location adjacent to the commercial heart of the town, then it places the town boundary under greater pressure because that housing needs to be provided somewhere. The Newcombe Street properties in the commercial zone, the sites identified through the UDF, the structure plan and policy in a number of ways, but a major development opportunity, a focal building and a priority development site. And the nomination of the land for this purpose is one which sets it aside from other parcels. So there's no other parcel of land in Portarlington that has this designation. The DDO 21 is applied to the entire town centre in the commercial zone, and this provides broad design objectives, none of which are mandatory. So the most controversial of these is the building form, which, as you've heard, states generally restrict buildings to a maximum height of 2 storeys. And that's the argument that objectors have put here tonight around the scale and the height of the building. So if we look at the 2 sites, we've got 11.5 metres permitted on the residential growth zone in Fenwick Street. We've then got a 6 metre fall, excuse me, waving arms, but we've got a 6 metre fall then across the property. If we were constrained then to a 2-storey building down here, we'd have a difference of about 9 metres between the top of the development on the commercial site and then what we're proposing on the residential growth zone. So the concept of a focal building or a major development opportunity or a priority site is lost if the res growth zone lot towers over the commercial zone. So it doesn't make sense to apply the DDO explicitly, remembering that the design objectives talk to generally a maximum of 2-storey. Now this issue of the DDO and of building heights came out in 1 to 2 Bluff Road in St Leonard's. Similar context, commercial 1 zone, a DDO right opposite the coastal reserve or the foreshore. Council sought to refuse the application based on building height. It was a 3-storey building. VCAT approved the development and they made a couple of statements which I'll take you to, but at paragraph 47 to 50 of their decision, they said the challenge is to interpret what is meant by retaining the low-scale character of the town centre. Guidance is found in the design objectives and responses in Table 1 of DDO 24. Regarding building form, a design objective is to ensure that buildings are designed to respond to the characteristics of the site and locality. The related design response, building heights to respect the scale of existing development in the town centre, generally 2-storey. Like the structure plan's objectives for the site, this is performance-based language It envisages a future scale of 2 stories generally for buildings in the town centre. It doesn't discount a taller building if the site's physical context allows it or some aspect of planning policy promotes it. In this case, I find the site size and location allows for a 3-storey building without unduly disrupting the future 2-storey general scale of the town centre. Local policy promotes a focal building here, a destination point between the town centre and the pier, and this can be a building distinguished by height. So in St Leonards, that site was also nominated as having a focal building. So the tribunal supported a building that was taller and identified that a taller building can, I guess, delineate that or distinguish that focal building from others. So I'm going to skip through some of this. I might just take you to the objections because I don't want to run out of time, which I normally do. Mr Kellen took you to the issue of the surrounding context and that the development didn't respond to that surrounding context. In the Bluff Road decision, the tribunal made it really clear that when you talk about the surrounding context, you have to have regard to what the planning scheme's seeking to achieve there. All of those lots are within that residential growth zone. All of those lots could be developed to 3 to 4 storey. Therefore, that surrounding context is not the underdeveloped land that you see now, but what it's going to be in the future and what the planning scheme directs it to be. He also talked to the periphery of the residential growth zone, that we should respect the character of residential areas, but that's a misunderstanding. The periphery of the residential growth zone is talking to the far end of that residential growth zone where it abuts general residential areas, not where it abuts the town centre. That's the core of the zone. So what we've done is created the higher density development at that core. Issues of privacy, noise and shadow were raised by Mr Fernandez, and in terms of privacy, and it's all detailed in the report, but that's all covered off by screening and design. Shadow has been fully assessed and the shadow is compliant as well. In terms of noise, there's no noise beyond what you would expect from extra residents, and if you designate this whole area for growth and for high density development, you're going to have more people living there. Mr Keeney took you to the DDO 21 and development of up to 3-storey, but as I've said, the res growth zone talks of development up to 4-storey. In terms of safety and access to Fenwick Street, we engaged Ratio, who are traffic engineers with the Geelong office, to undertake an assessment. They've assessed car parking, the waiving of car parking, the access, volume of traffic in the surrounding streets and so on. That's all been reviewed by council as well, and no one's raised any issues with it. Lewis has already taken you to some of the sort of design elements, but from a streetscape perspective, what we've sought to do is accommodate narrow defined shop fronts with brick facades, articulated and detached forms. We've tried to create 3 separate building blocks, I guess, separated by first floor gardens. Upper levels are recessed, and that's really deliberate so that when you're standing on the opposite side of Newcombe Street looking back at this site, you won't see that upper level. You won't see the 5th storey, you only see a little element of that 4th storey. Back from the foreshore as well, we've been through a really extensive assessment of foreshore views. There's really only one location down on the foreshore as you step off the pier where there's a small gap in the trees where you can see the easternmost building. And that's only an element of that, so it doesn't dominate any views. Now my time's up. I think I'll just conclude and say I think what we've created is a development that does respond to the planning controls. It is change, but it does minimise impact on neighbours. It's well designed, it's well considered, and we would ask for your support.
Thank you, Tony. I understand one of the things that you said in regards to a focal building, a focal point. I think in some of the recommendations I've noted that focal doesn't only need to be height. So are there other elements that make this a focal point, this building?
I mean, it depends how you define focal. Focal's not defined in the planning scheme. What we've done is had a look at if we were to develop these two sites quite separately, we need to do something on the commercial site that's not going to be, I guess, towered over by what's happening on the residential growth zone. So what's happening on the res growth zone is completely within the sort of terms of the planning scheme. If we were to do something really small here, as I said, we wouldn't create a focal building. It would just fall into that streetscape that exists in the commercial centre as it is now.
Questions?
May I ask what the purpose is going to be for the 59 dwellings? There's a lot of mention to short-term accommodation. Is that going to be the pure purpose of them?
So I suppose our primary objective is to cover development costs with the initial offerings of the apartments. The balance will be retained for short-term accommodation.
Be managed by yourself then? Okay.
We suspect even the ones that we sell will be short-term.
And I saw you nodding in the background when I mentioned local procurement. Could you expand on that for me, please?
Yes, sorry. So we are doing the development at 1 to 2 Bluff Road as well. We have got project managers from Melbourne. The undertaking was that they use at least 70% trades, local trades. So I think on that project, our architect can confirm it, I think they're using over 70% trades. They're using my local trades that I previously used on my projects. So.
Thank you. 70% is quite high. Thank you.
Councillor Howell.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions, I guess, about the actual proposal itself. You're proposing to have a gym and a pool within the facility. Will the gym and the pool, will they be available for public use?
It's part of the residential.
Apartment use only, basically. I notice in the, I presume this has come from your office. This is just a schematic of the front area. And what I'm actually alluding to is the actual plantation of trees, etc., around the actual potential building. And I think there's a comment raised about just growth of trees that are sort of projected here, about how they may have issues actually growing to certain heights. I'm just curious as to why that would be. You would have such sort of, as much as there should be greenery through it, but obviously one of the prime selling points will be views of this type of development. I'm just curious as to, is this what is proposed? And will the trees grow in these particular locations?
Yeah, reviewed. It was an issue that was actually raised really early on in the soil and depth and so on to accommodate that planting. So it is consistent with what we're hoping to achieve.
Any other questions? Thank you. Well, I'll now open it up to the panel for discussion. No discussion? We have someone ready to make a recommendation. Oh, I'm sorry, Councillor Asher, did you have your hand up then? No? So is someone ready, a councillor prepared to make a recommendation?
I am. I've just got to...
Please go ahead. Have you... What are you going to recommend?
My recommendation is to accept the recommendation from the officers and to grant a permit for the application. But unfortunately, it's just come back on, my computer's not working to actually read out the actual, the wording, but that is my
do we have a seconder?
I'll second it for debate.
The recommendation is that the responsible authority, having considered all the matters within the Planning and Environment Act 1987 requires it to consider, that it is required to consider, decides to issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit for the use of the land for dwellings and development of the land for the 7 shops and 59 dwellings, multi-lot subdivision adjacent to the transport zone to alter access to a transport zone to and reduction of car parking at 20 to 34 Newcombe Street and 25 to 27 Fenwick Street, Portarlington, in accordance with the plans and documentation submitted with the applicant, subject to the following conditions, of which there are several, and I'm sure have been available to all to view. The reason that I'm supporting the application is, I guess, having been a long-time resident of Portarlington in previous years, during the summer months. I've watched the town closely over a long period of time, and I've watched the town, I guess, stagnate. I've watched the town try to advance. I've watched the town take opportunities when they are rarely offered. And I think the fact that in recent times the township of Portarlington has now become a substantial focus on the Bellarine. I think now is the time to look at what the next opportunity is for that township. Obviously, the ferries have had a huge impact and will continue to do so if we're able to progress the work that's been done. Now, I know and I fully appreciate the objectors' concerns, and I fully understand that, having been subject to similar circumstances myself. But I'm looking for the longer-term vision for the Portarlington region and for the population of the Bellarine. And we are already under enormous stress for development opportunities on the Bellarine. We've had the introduction of the distinctive areas of landscape down through there, which has put on severe restrictions for further development. And this particular development in a particular location of Newcombe Street, to my mind, is a suitable and proper location. I don't, from what I've seen and what I've heard, and the discussions that have been had, I haven't formed a view that the development is overdeveloped. I think it's a modest development to what actually could potentially have been there, and I find that it is consistent with what you would expect to see today in development within certain locations, particularly around our bays and waterways. This is what we're seeing, and I think it's will be an addition that long term will prove to be of great value to the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Jim. Mr Chair, and thank you, Councillor Harwood. I'm really in two minds in this application. From the objector's point of view, I do understand that this is the largest development we've had in the centre of town thus far. It is a sizable building. It was a focal point. The effects that it has on the people living around it will exist. There will be an effect. There will be more people, more cars. It will be something that you cannot possibly miss. However, I do on the other hand understand, as past tourism chair for the area and somebody who lives in Portarlington understands it intimately, that we are over 1,000 beds short at our recent studies, actually for a couple of years now in this region, to help support. We need short-term accommodation to help support the wineries, the tourism, the industries, the economic boons that we're actually so proud of in our region across the northern Bellarine. People can't get to them without having short-term accommodation in our region. We fought very hard to have the town settlement boundaries put in 2018, which were backed up by the distinctive areas and landscapes last year. And we're very happy that we're not going further out in urban expansion. But when you stop going outwards, the trade-off is that you do have to put in mixed-use, higher development internally in your city centres there, or town centres. So there are new places available for people to live and utilise. If you can't go out, you must go up. It's one or the other. So I do see the trade-offs and the benefits of having something like this in the centre of town, and we do want to increase the people living in the centre of Portarlington and the commercial viabilities of having shop fronts year-round. Year-round commerce is something that is vital for our townships along the Bellarine. But I do understand that this is a large step compared to what is currently in existence within the township itself. So I remain in two minds, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Councillor Asher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Similar to Mayor Sullivan, it's slightly in two minds, although I do tend to agree with Councillor Harwood. This is essentially infill. This is what it looks like. We've had the settlement strategy to fix the boundaries of the townships, and I don't think anybody will dispute the fact that there is going to be growth, particularly in Portarlington with the ferry service there now, and it is an absolute jewel in the Bellarine Crown as a township. We do need more accommodation, both short-term and permanent accommodation as well. And look, I see a lot of effort has gone into this particular application to ensure that it's a balanced response as well. The zoning does allow for it, actually encourages exactly this sort of development. Resi growth and commercial are both highly appropriate, and I do fully appreciate that residents, particularly those nearby, don't like to see the town change, and it is disturbing. It's happened where I live as well. It is part of being on the Bellarine. But I do also make the point that if it's not this development, it would be another one. So in terms of relativity, I see this as a very reasonable proposal, and I support the application on that basis. And I do hear Tony's point too, that if this is rejected, then it's very likely that VCAT would not reject it. So that just is time and money not necessarily well spent. So I will be supporting the officer recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Asher. Councillor Cadwell.
Thank you. Look, on the basis of the comments that have been made by Councillor Harwood, Councillor Mayor Sullivan and Councillor Asher, I have to agree that I would support the application. I note that there were 29 objectors and 45 supporters. I do certainly take the validity of the objectors' concerns, but I do think that it's meeting a significant mixed-use accommodation need in Portarlington, and without it, I think it is actually holding Portarlington back. So,
thank you. I'll say something. I've also had some trouble, and I've spent quite some time thinking about this, but when you study all of the work that's been done, almost everything complies. And the distinctive areas of landscape and statement of planning policies and all of the other planning documents that have long history have indicated that this is a development opportunity. It's required that if we have town boundaries, we have increased density of dwellings. I have been worried to some extent that this focal point, there was perhaps too much emphasis on height, where there could be other elements of focus. But I do understand it is a high quality building, and I do understand it could have been more intense than it is. So on balance, I also support acceptance of the officer recommendation. Do you want to say something, Councillor Aitken? Well, I think we've all spoken. I think we've reached a point where I can put the motion. Those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Good night all, and sorry for the late